Back, everyone. This will be lecture 6 for day 2, and the title is, again, just a working title, Modern Indian Literature Survey of Some Recent Voices. And that's exactly what it is. It's a very selective survey because it's hard to capture all of the recent voices. Partly, I also I'm interested in this, obviously, the eco-critical post-colonial voices. Uh, so I should have perhaps specified that. So um, until fairly recently, the most novels labeled post-colonial have been set in primarily in cities. Now there are exceptions. I'm just saying majority, and all until recently. That is until maybe 20 years ago. And although these important novels reflect urban sensibilities that align with those of most readers, they obviously leave out the majority of people and spaces, right? Or it could be an urban traveler going to the forest, as we'll see with Gangopadhyay's novel. So it's either an urban setting or an urban sensibility, but they leave this quite a large segment out. Um, of course, this is true of many works that are not labeled post colonial, especially in those in languages other than English, which have represented rural areas to some degree. But as I've mentioned, the label post colonial literature, I think I've mentioned this, is both elastic and limited. So it's broad. And as the nature of this course exemplifies, right? It covers a huge number of possible ways of reading texts. And it was originally the label itself was originally developed by urbanized scholars, writing mostly in the Western Academy, who understandably were on the lookout, if you're talking 30 plus years ago, for non Western works with clear themes of anti colonialism, nationalism, and the complex effects of race, gender, and class. That was all very productive. That is, it still is. In the past maybe 15 years, however, healthy debates about these assumptions and even the viability of the term post colonial have led us to what I believe is a much wider and more discerning uh, um, way of looking at these texts, of understanding non European works of literature. Indeed, many English department ads today do not advertise for post colonial, they advertise for Anglophone literatures. Um, and so it's interesting to see how this has changed because we have Francophone, we have Lusophone, and so on. But this expands it out. Now, there is a risk of de emphasizing ethical issues and so on. There's a risk in every label. But, and each label, any label has its problems. It's simply a way of corralling and categorizing what we read. At the same time, such literatures have been productively interpreted through an eco-critical lens, as I've said. So this has added a great deal to pre-existing works, and usually by drawing on an interdisciplinary range of scholarship. So again, we could, to use the example I was using, there are many readings of Things Fall Apart from an eco-critical lens, right? So that was not considered until fairly recently. Um, we can also look at works of fiction like Ghosh's Ibis trilogy, and more broadly, perhaps the Blue Humanities, about the roles that oceans play in global literature. So I'm not touching on that in this talk or in these lectures. And we can reread canonical texts in that way. There is a danger, by the way. I mentioned the pairing, which is very helpful to do for teaching, which is pairing, say, Heart of Darkness with Things Fall Apart, right, as a way to show that. The danger, as David Damrosch has pointed out, is hypercanonicity, sort of the way that, okay, now we're saying these canonical texts are clearly biased, but we're going to keep teaching them because we're comparing them now to another one. So we may keep going back to the Shakespeare, to the Milton, to the practicality is we leave little space for more and more texts that are produced. I don't know how we resolve that. I'm just saying that that's a challenge. In this lecture, I'll review 3 novels that some of you will know more, be more familiar with than me, that deal with non-urban spaces. A couple of them with, all of them with forests, by writers whose sensibilities seem less beholden to urban outlooks, even though they are, of course, modern, educated writers. We're not saying that, but I think that's they have taken us a little bit further away from the classic paradigms of the urban country city milieu. Eastern Inkire, a novel and folklorist from Nagaland, writes fiction in English about her region and culture. This region, of course, composed of many groups and languages distinct from the rest of India, is experiencing an explosion of writing, mostly in English, but not all, with Nagas, Mizos, Apatanis, and so on, tapping into their rich veins of orality, much of it conditioned by their mountainous forested homelands to give written expression to their conflicted identities. This inner conflict is not surprising, given the sense of being doubly subjugated by Europeans and then by the Indian state to some degree. I know this is a sensitive topic. I'm just saying that these are the topics that come up in these works. I'm not advocating one way or another, as I tell the camera. Northeastern groups have therefore sought a measure of political autonomy in various ways, but in that healthy way, it's through writing, right? As you know, this has been an exciting area. Kire's 2014 novel, When the River Sleeps, is set entirely in a forest, does not deal with urban context at all, follows the journey of a middle-aged Naga man named Villi, I guess how you pronounce it, who works for India's forest department. That's the modern connection, right? We're never told exactly when the story takes place, except that it's in the modern period. We have the forest department, we have guns, things like that. And after the advent of Christianity to the region in the 19th century, so somewhere in the 20th century, right? It's worth noting that I think something from one statistic I saw, 88% are Christian in this particular region. But I don't know if that's how accurate that is now, but that was one census. The topographical detail, on the other hand, is richly described. Teak trees, riverine ferns, these are from her novel written in English. Plantain or plantain, depends on how you want to pronounce it, trees. Herbs like bitter wormwood and amaranth. Very specific, right? Villi's fellow Angamis, a clan within the larger Naga tribal group, think he's odd. So again, the complexity, he's not representing all Nagas, obviously. They think he's odd for preferring to live year-round in the forest rather than in a village. He does miss the, quote, ordinary things of village life, but after 25 years at his job, he concludes, the forest is my wife, and perhaps this is what marriage is like. With periods of when a chasm of loneliness separates the partners. I don't know why I'm laughing, but it's interesting to think of that, how he says this. More than anything, he wants to find a sleeping river. This is the title that he first heard about as a boy, and which he's been dreaming of ever since. I can't even touch on, and I'm not as astute to read this, but the function of dreams is fascinating in a lot of these works. So he's interested in finding this sleeping river, and the story was more than a story to him. He has always wanted to catch the river when it went to sleep so that he can wrest a stone from the heart and take it home, where the stone will grant you whatever it is empowered to grant you. It could be cattle, women, prowess in war, or success on the hunt. So we have, in one sense, a classic quest motif, right? To find something, remember, mentioned Gilgamesh, we can go back to ancient literature. It seems to be eternally human. To have this quest motif, but in a kind of different setting, of course. One can, in short, make the magic of this heartstone yours, as she writes. Is it possible, he asks himself, that only forest dwellers can understand such things exist in the places not frequented by man? Will the magic of the river work only for a believer? Would it work in spite of lack of faith? So, in subtle ways, we do get a man who is a self-reflecting individual. He's not part of a community very much. That's what's interesting, right? Typically, indigenous stories will accentuate the community. And I think this does, but by producing the opposite, by saying you don't have the community, that's a glaring omission. So conspicuous by what's missing, I think in that way Kire arguably calls attention. She's calling attention to his solitude. And this was one of the problems. To get to the river, Vili will have to trek through different forests, some familiar and some dangerous and unfamiliar. And so he packs his essentials: a hunting knife, tobacco, tea, salt, a gun, and salted venison. And after a 4-hour hike to a settlement of itinerant Nepali woodcutters, again, here you have this modern sort of migratory labor, who are the closest neighbors, he is swallowed up by the trees of the forest. Interesting choice of words. He spends the night in an empty shed belonging to another Naga clan. This is still somewhat familiar territory, but in the middle of the night, his hunter ear picks up the softest fall of padded feet. He woke with a start, the hair on his arms standing on end at the knowledge that he was not alone, and then a great paw smashes through the shed's old tin and weak wood, as she writes. And as Vili runs to the door, quote, a tiger came at him fearlessly, throwing itself at the outline of the man. Vili sidestepped the beast, which crashed into the door, breaking it and leaving torn fragments of wood hanging on its hinges. He shot off a bullet, and in the flash, he saw that the tiger was much bigger than any he had ever seen. At this moment, you might think this is a Gothic adventure story, but it's not, right? The tiger returns, and Vili now understands that this is in English, were-tiger, W-E-R-E, right? Like a werewolf. It's a were-tiger. Since ordinary tigers kept their distance from man, this one was coming back for more, unafraid of the gun. And Vili, is trying to think of names of men in the region who knew the art of transforming their spirits into tigers. So again, this is not uncommon anthropologically or culturally. Throughout the world, you have Native American lore as well. You can have shapeshifters or people who either can shift their shape or change their shape at will, or they are stuck in a different form. But again, what it does is it shows the close connection of the human world to the blurred boundaries, right? At least that's what anthropologists will say, that sort of liminal aspect, whether you believe it or not. And of course, you would say that she presents it as if it's real, right? Just as Achebe presents, the priestess and the oracle in Things Fall Apart as real. We're not to judge this on an empirical basis, right? That's not the point, as would have been done in past times, right? Maybe a few decades ago. Why are you treating me as a stranger, he cries. I come in peace. You owe me your hospitality. I'm your guest. He shouted these words out with absolute faith that they were being listened to and heeded, Sure enough, the animal retreated for the second time, but not before it had made a call like a warrior's ululating cry. So not words, but not a tiger's call either. Vili recalls the words of his village seer who had told him years ago that to find the sleeping river, he would sometimes have to struggle against spiritual powers that no gun could stop. So you might say, well, maybe this is a fable, right? An allegory, perhaps. But that's not indicated in the text. And I think that's shrewd on the part of Kire. She's not saying this is just a story to really make a point about the reality. This is his reality. So whether you believe it or not, right? And so I think that's another interesting area that I found. I've been doing work on pilgrimage, and it's interesting to see how different belief systems function, and how I think Amitav Ghosh portrays this in The Hungry Tide, as I mentioned the other day, to push that sense of empirical fact, right, to its limit, right? Not in the, I could go off and I better stop, but with Franz Kafka and the Metamorphoses and so forth. But animal studies talks about this a lot. We talked about animals, people. But these, I think, are still very much in a kind of urban said ethos, where there's a kind of knowingness to the narrator. Here, I don't have that feeling. And it's hard to know, and I think that's her intention. It's hard for us, we get a bit disoriented there. And I think that's her intention, right? This kind of alien, what are the references? Is there a reality here, right? The next day, Vili hikes, I better watch how much time I have. Okay. He hikes, his hike takes him to the Nettle Forest, capitalized, an area avoided by his clan and frequented by another. That's another common reality that a lot of groups who live with forests they'll have sacred groves on the one hand, as Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha have talked about. On the other hand, which are only secret as well to them. On the other hand, they will avoid certain forests, like the evil forest in Things Fall Apart. So, again, it's interesting where he says, he reached the Nettle Forest, he saw 3 figures ahead and became tense, wondering if the seemingly real sight, that's her words, would metamorphose into something else. Now he's on edge because, right, are they going to change into were-tigers or something? But then he says he's relieved to find that they are women from a friendly border village of another clan who are harvesting nettle to make yarn. He finds it refreshing to meet real people and have a normal conversation. So he's a solitary guy, but now he's venturing into a forest realm he's unfamiliar with. He and the other women of the group reminisce about past times when their 2 clans bartered with each other and knew one another's tongues. Sad that the younger ones haven't learned other languages, Vili says. Trying his hand at pulling out the nettles, he's immediately stung. Damn, he exclaims, that was more painful than the nettle we have in our village. It's stronger than the species found in your area, says the woman. It yields better yarn, but it stings harder too. So you have this sort of ordinary, non-urban setting. So now you have a people who experience it differently and just matter-of-factly, right? Hey, I don't know. I didn't know about this. So I think that's really interesting. I think she suggests several interrelated topics that are important. So in this forest that's far removed from modern life, it makes sense that he's worried about what is real and what is not. My interest here is in the Northeast Indian setting of this phenomenon where forests are rapidly disappearing. And as we know, she does not talk about that explicitly, right? And as we know, when a people's forests disappear, their belief systems tend to as well. And indigenous people like the Naga, to use the broad term, don't simply live within a forest, they think it, right? To use Cohn's word. The novel's particular narrative mode similarly reconnects us to questions about language. presented in an orthographic and material medium, an English language novel, that many Nagas who live in this setting may not have access to. Maybe not many, but some. We may wonder how the novel reshapes folk stories expressing the overlap between biological and spirit worlds. Right? Does this presentation, in other words, package regional identities in ways that make them more amenable to an urban readership? Or how does its forest regionalism echo or contrast with expressions of national identity that we've talked about? For instance, the story about forest spirits intersects in interesting ways with Mahashweta Devi's stories and others. And for one thing, the readers will immediately note the conspicuous absence of history in the novel. Now, this raises another issue because a lot of post-colonial scholars and a lot of novels, fiction and poetry, will accentuate the fact that a lot of indigenous peoples, the way they were kind of pushed out of the realm of agency was to dehistoricize them and think of them as timeless, right? They're just there to be like the noble savage, right? But that dehumanizes them. It doesn't give them any agency. So this would seem at first to be a problem. That is to say, if there's no history here, there aren't any references that we habitually are used to. Where are we, right? And so on. It would seem to be a problem. And I think Kire perhaps is forcing us to think about, perhaps one could argue, I'm just speculating, that to say that, yes, that is a problem when you portray indigenous peoples as timeless and objectify them. On the other hand, is the capital H history necessary for everyone, right? Or can we say, do certain local peoples have their own sense of what history means? Right? It is a creation after all, right? So I think it raises more questions. I'm thinking of, let me read this. Predation, so being a predator, is a key motif in this novel, as it is in other forest fictions, but not in the conventional senses of either the hunting of animals or the predatory exploitation of forests by outsiders. The narrative could be characterized as expressing an ecology of cells or a relational system of being, as Eduardo Kohn says, in which the question of who is predator and who is prey, becomes complicated. Not only is Vili preyed upon by other men, because there are some altercations that happen, and not only does he hunt animals for food, but he is attacked by were-tigers and other spirit beings. But if the relationships in these cases are contextually dependent, is it accurate to describe them as predatory? Unlike, say, Mary Oran, whom we'll encounter in Mahashweta Devi's The Hunt, Vili's understanding of human-animal spirits is part of his social imaginary rather than an intrusion by outsiders. So this predation is not something that comes from without. It's in the forest. That inverts the typical paradigm. I'm getting a little philosophical here, but the point is, I think she's trying to shift our paradigms. That's all. You will have to gauge whether you agree, you feel that's successful or not. Kide's text, I suggest, resists our conventional literary and sociological expectations by disconnecting its realist tropes, so realistic fiction, from their expected signifiers, and by providing scenes that read as subtle critiques of interpretation, typical interpretation. One example is when Vili happens to witness a man's murder by two Nagas who are not part of his clan village, and then becomes their prey. So he witnesses it, they know he's witnessed it, now they're going to go after him. Captured and accused of being a threat to the men's clan, he's brought before the village elder. He is saved by coincidence. The elder remembers meeting him long before and is favorably inclined. The man points to the burn mark of a bullet that grazed Vili's skin as proof that he, Not the other two men is the hunted rather than the hunter. Vili is deemed innocent and freed and carries on in his quest. So, interestingly enough, I think whereas novelists like, say, Raja Rao or Amitav Ghosh can rely on their Indian readers' familiarity with village tropes, I'm thinking of Kantapura and other things. In other words, you can rely on familiar tropes, right? So we can also rely, if we're reading, arguably, if you're reading Anandamat, you can rely on the trope of the creepers of the classical connection, right? But here, again, the average reader in English here in urban metropolitan areas doesn't have that reference. So what do? Kire's readers are thrust into a region that usually appears in mainstream media as a space of either natural wildness or insurgency or something else, right? So this is just a place that it is what it is. And I think we're thrust into that in order to sort of make us disoriented and then question our own assumptions. So I'm going to stop there. I think there's so much more one could speculate in this, but it's an interesting novel. It's, again, it's almost fable-like, but it's not. And so you see what you think of it. We'll move now to Temsulo Ao, whose select poems we'll look at just briefly. And again, Naga, and as you know, a late professor and activist, very well known. And I would say, kind of like Mahashweta Devi, kind of equally well known for activism as for writing. Right. In this first poem, I'll just read snippets of Soul Bird. She writes, "They are chanting prayers, but I watch a lonely hawk soaring amidst the swirling blue. Wings darken the whiteness of the rushing clouds. It moves in hesitant circles, emitting an unearthly sound. Hawkeyes seemingly riveted on the mound below, fenced in by newly cut bamboo. The mourners depart from this obscure bit of disturbed earth. But grandmother clings to the new-made barrier guarding the fresh mound, but grandmother clings to the new-made barrier guarding the fresh mound." Repetition, right? "Until her grieving heart senses a presence hovering in the sky, she turned her gaze, red-rimmed eyes settled on the circling silhouette, and then with a sudden, unseemly whoop, she draws me closer, whispering in my ear, 'See that keening bird in the sky? That's your mother's soul saying her final goodbye. It is over. Come, let us go home now.'" Nice. This is a different genre. But it's also not thrusting us into the unfamiliarity of a forest, but perhaps, I wouldn't say unfamiliarity, but invoking the blurred boundaries of nature and self, perhaps, to some degree. The connection to nature, maybe most obviously. Also, there's the opposition of pronouns like I and then they or you. What does that mean? They are chanting prayers, but I watch a lonely hawk, right? There are also connections of geography, the earth, right? And connections to the disturbed earth, and then can also invoke through memory, right? The idea of the grandmother remembering this. Perhaps you could read this, and I'm thinking of these other poems I assigned as well, as saying, first of all, the importance of storytelling, right? As in many indigenous cultures, because of the more emphasis on orality. And it can happen, it doesn't have to be in indigenous cultures, it can be for anyone. But this idea of, remember I said we might have to question what history is in Kire's novel. So here I think perhaps history are the memories of your forebears and your own grandparents and your parents. After all, what is history? When the if you look at the history of the novel, it's interesting to see how many in the 1700s were called the true history of Moll Flanders, or the history of Daniel Defoe, because we have sort of accentuated those categories, but the history was just the story of a life, right? Or as feminists have said, it's his story, not her story, but it's a story of a life. And so we ourselves, even in modern sense, may have sort of narrowed that purview of what history is, right? And I think Dipesh Chakrabarti, by looking at poetry, for example, and Ranjit Guha, are trying to find some way of an alternate view of history, even as they grapple with modern history. So with these poems, I think it's almost song-like. I think at times it's reflective. Let me just read a couple more. I'll just read one more poem. Heaven and Earth. Empty words these, vaunted designations without locations and avowed destinations without roadmaps. No geography is theirs to claim or history to affirm. Only clever innuendos that play on gullible minds. Heaven for me is where my heart throbs, and earth that clime where it ought to thrive. But heaven, you say, is where earth is not, because you insist they do not belong. So then, who identifies the space and apportions the time for the mislocated heaven and earth? Is it geography or history, or the same old word vendors spewing more sophistry to harass and hound befuddled wayfarers like you and me seeking heaven on a vacuous earth? So who are the arbiters, the gatekeepers of geography, what the meaning of geography is, of history? And we know there's a lot of critique, healthy self-critique among scholars about, as anthropologists, I think, were the first modern disciplines to do in the 1980s, to start saying, maybe we should anthropologize ourselves, as James Clifford has done. So if you look at this, I think she's, and I know it's hard to, when you're just hearing it, it's something worth rereading. One thing she's critiquing is the fact that no one can claim geography, right? This is again an anti-colonial. It's even an anti-nation state word in the modern sense. It also talks about the fact that it's anti-romantic. It's anti-romantic in the sense of not wanting to say that heaven is this, right? It's not like my pure homeland, right? It is, and so then who identifies the space and apportions the time for the mislocated heaven and earth? And I think that's a profound statement. And this reminds me too of what I mentioned the other day, yesterday, Brian Friel's 1980 play Translations Again, which is this idea of cartography and naming and so forth. And I think she's calling us. The other part of this is, I like her phrase, befuddled wayfarers like you and me. So that could be, oh yes, that's life and all. But on the other hand, it's hard to do without GPS. Can we do without clocks? We fetishize the clock and the phone. So I think in that sense, we can all relate to it. On another level, it's about dispossession, right? It's about taking agency away from the people who live there. And so it's a critique of the nation state, but it's also a critique of any kind of dominant system. So you can read it on different ways. She also has a wonderful story about, poem called Legacy about birthing. And you can read this idea. It's a real birth, very, very earthy, but it's also says that, the child has to be, you're a fighter from the start, and has to be put in a sterile room. So perhaps based on her own birth. But then you can read birth as poetry, right? Birth as kind of entering the world, and you don't know what's going to become of it, right? So I think that's interesting. She has a final one that I assigned called Wood Smoke, and just talks about ordinary evenings in a hut with a few shrimps, a handful of rice, and wild herbs. She talks about hunger or hungry evenings. So there's hunger, but there's also the idea of nature as sustainer. So that's how I read it. I'll just end this by saying Ao famously advocated for a more authentic, less stereotyped understanding of Naga and Northeastern cultures, which, as she has noted, is different from those that also inhabit Northeast India. So we can't just put them all together, but nonetheless, she has been read in that sense. In a survey course, you could say that Ao's work, like ours, right? Ao's work can serve as a reminder of the rich explosion of literary works from this region, and also it reflects her aim of presenting the full range of Naga cultures to a broad audience. Her choice of English, after all, is important. Even though she was fluent in several other languages, point to her aim of reaching in such an audience. One scholar nicely summarizes her body of work as one that interrogates the frictions between identity, boundaries, and globalization. The bulk of her writing is personal, inflected with stories of her childhood and anecdotes from her life, biography, annals, and memoir. And I think this idea of reaching for sometimes hybrid text, we're going to encounter that with an early century-old African-American text tomorrow, trying to access all kinds of different writing media, different genres, refusing to be saying that this is what a novel is, right? This is what a poem has to do, which is, let's face it, we are all constrained by that, right? Sometimes. So it's very hard to break from that. We have still some time, good. We have Kaveri Nambisan, The Scent of Pepper. And as I said, I went to Coorg, not for this, because of this. I just, by myself, I was, first time I got a little grant, small grant to go to, I was already in India, so I got a small grant to study forest. I said, well, I better just have to do the tough job of going to a forest retreat. Someone has to do it. So I did that, and it was very beautiful. And it's interesting how the Kodagus or the Kurgis are so different, right, in many ways. But so I'm not talking loud enough, but so are a lot of groups, right? And I think every group has those identities, but it is really interesting. So she narrates the multi-generational story. I'm just going to introduce this briefly. Story of the Kalyanda family, Kodava family of the forested Kodagu region, who are proud descendants of warriors who became owners of pepper and coffee estates. Their success attracts the jealous eyes of other estate owners, and the novel, which at times is an homage to the Kodava past, presents us with colorful family members, especially many strong and vibrant women. The storyline follows these three generations during times of momentous change in 20th century India, changes in profession, modernization, environment. The effects of these changes are especially hard on the men in the family whose past warrior fame is less appreciated than before, and who are sometimes overtaken by despair. These features mean that the novel fits well, perhaps, within the broad rubric of post-colonial eco-criticism. One of the male members, Subu, captures the ennui or the chronic boredom, aimlessness that he and his peers are experiencing when he says sophistication was a shell. You were what you were, children of Tariandamulu, I don't know if I'm pronouncing these right, Malitirani and Brahmagiri, with a kernel of honor and helplessness, fearlessness, born to care for the land made sacred by the goddess and protector of Kodagu. So their own system. The matriarch is the widow Nanji, who we are told has made her family house the sacred system of nobility, and who more than anyone was to make it the strongest fortress of the Kelianda clan. I'll end with a snippet, a paragraph from her to give you a sense of her style, and then we'll move to the last novel. So this describes the land, because talking about the eco-critical aspect, which Nanji herself has discerned is ideal for growing pepper. So she's the one who realizes, hey, we can grow pepper, right? It was Nanji's friendly, inquisitive nature that had led her to the discovery that the climate was ideal for growing pepper. By questioning the Mapla, the Muslim men, she found that what pepper needed was a long spell of monsoon, fairly warm temperature for a few months, and a good amount of shade. Like many of her neighbors, she had already experimented with a few vines that she planted around the mango trees near the house, and they produced just enough pepper to use with fried pork. They do like pork, I found out. No one in Kodagu had thought of cultivating pepper in a big way until Nanji thought it was worth trying. So anyway, she discovers that it's not only the red berries that are lucrative, other parts of the plant have many uses, quote unquote, as carminative, digestive, and when mixed with honey to soothe sore throats that were common among the young ones during the monsoon. Now, Kaveri Nambisan is also a surgeon. So she brings sometimes the ideas of illness and recuperation are from her own experience. She serves the poor there in this area generally. So again, strong women who are creating what they can out of and sustainably creating a productive environment based on what they have before them. Because sadly, you can see how change has, in the novel at least, how change has made the men kind of a little more despairing relatively. Did I lose something here? Oh, Sarah Joseph. Now we come to the last novel, just enough time, I think. A Gift in Green, apparently written at the same time in English, that is published in the same year, in English and Malayalam. So she writes in bilingually. I think that's interesting if we're talking about the language issue, right? It focuses on a Dalit community called Pulaya, who live in the village of Ati in Kerala. It's obviously a fictional village, who are initially shown to live in balance with their forested habitat. Their covenant with the area's water and with the larger environment sustains them both physically and culturally. But then a past member of the village called Kumaran returns with his ambitious plans to develop the area. Classic story, right? Partly by duping the villagers, he ushers in a voracious modern worldview that seeks the area's lucrative minerals and that brings with it both pollutants and germs. As Joseph puts it, this outside infusion of greed and modernity, and here's the quote, fattened itself with an insatiable metallic chomping, like a patient whose hunger aggravated the more he ingested. It chomped up everything in its gigantic mouth, snapped up and swallowed hills, forests, rivers, paddy fields, marshes, and excreted townships. Makes me wonder where I live. But hard, it's very critical, hard-hitting, and that's her intention, right? The phrase metallic chomping reminded me of a snippet I might show either tomorrow or maybe the last day of a famous BBC video from about 15 years ago of something called the lyre bird, Lyre. You may have seen this video, which imitates the sounds, anything it hears, and what it hears is a chainsaw in the forest of Brazil. Tragic, right? A brilliant video, and it sounds exactly like a chainsaw. That's its new reality, right? And pretty soon it won't be able to do that because its habitat will be gone. Now I'm just going to read a little bit from a sort of contextualize all of this by some notes I have made, and hopefully this touches on all these novels in some way. So this comes a bit from my current research, so I hope it fits in. Anthropologist Kiran Shinde, echoing others, has observed that the dialectic between the place and its story is central to the understanding of landscape. So others have made the same observation. Without story, there is no place, if you think about it. A place is meaningful to someone or some group. It has to be made meaningful through its myths and stories and so on, folk tales. If there is no story, if there's no one to tell those stories anymore, it loses that value, as, for example, we can see all over the world, right? In America, it's gobbled up all kinds of lands, or we have the Andaman Islands and so on. So this is a story replicated everywhere. So if those people are erased or displaced, then, or their story subdued, silenced, you don't have to compete with that, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. David Sofer, the late cultural geographer, said that the message of place is compounded of both the myth of the place and the direct experience of it. That's another part of it. So in other words, without story, there's no place, and stories about place are therefore part of what scholars sometimes term traditional ecological knowledge, right? Which, for example, Gadgil and Guha noted 3 decades ago, is indispensable for the preservation of endangered ecosystems. You cannot preserve, it's very hard to preserve ecosystems, let's put it this way. And I'm not an ecologist, I'm relying on them. It's hard to preserve ecosystems without the aid of the people who live there. If those people are not there, it's even more, it's very difficult. Just as we know that ethnobiologists will tell us that the storehouse of knowledge, like in the Amazon for medicinal plants, is rapidly diminishing. Pretty soon we'll lose a lot of that knowledge, right? Both because we've cut the trees down and we've displaced the people. So, as I think was said in the first day by Dr. Mahesh, was that it, professor who was here? He's an environmental engineer. You can't do environmental engineering without talking to people who are going to be affected by that, right? And that was the problem of so much, not just colonialism, but neocolonialism and World Bank aid and all that stuff. So if you're interested, Rob Nixon, among others, is very eloquent on this topic. In Gift of Green, Joseph accentuates the importance of storytelling for indigenous communities in several ways, including by interspersing her novel with sections she calls storytelling nights. So suddenly you'll have remember I talked about trying to, I'm not sure if this works, and I'm just testing this out. Maybe this is part of that approach that's refusing to follow the typical linear novel fashion. Now, there are many other experiments with the novel. I don't mean obviously, right? And Garcia Marquez and all these people. But I think to consciously intersperse, suddenly have storytelling, a night of a story, is fascinating, right? In a modern context. Because this is about modern toxins. Remember we talked about toxic discourse, and I think this works into there. Gadgil and Guha have argued about sorting people into groups that they call omnivores, ecosystem people, and ecological refugees. Omnivores are us. We have access to all kinds of foods. right? Doesn't mean we eat them all. We just have access. Ecosystem people are living more or less off the land. That's still the majority of the world and the planet. Ecological refugees are the lowest in the rung who have been displaced for one reason or another, either because someone's building a dam, or because their habitat has been cut down, or because of climate change, perhaps. So I think it's useful to keep. I was relying on another essay on this actually, but for this use of Gadgil and Guhu, but in pertaining to Joseph. But I think it's useful to keep this in mind because it fits well with a reading of the novel. In Joseph's novel, as one critic points out, storytellers have pride of place in the local community. Thus, here's a snippet from the novel. Putting down their bundles, the storytellers, capital S, who came year after year, would take a dip in the cool water of Ati. This is the fictional village. Emerging from the water, they would clad themselves in white. The Karnavar, I guess, of Ati would then, is that right? Yeah, elder, thank you. Would then lead the storyteller, capital S, by the hand into the boat and make him sit on the prow. The ceremonial boat would be anchored in the ferry bank, on the ferry bank that stretched like the neck of a bottle into the courtyard of Tampuran's shrine. Even as the storyteller took his appointed place on the prow of the boat, the introducer would arrive from the east rowing his boat. In faithful compliance with the traditions of Ati, the introducer, wearing a headgear and mask, a torch blazing in his hand, would step into the water. So this idea of storytelling and ritual, right? That's what's key here. Now, this is before the intrusion of the outside. So now we also have the idea of, remember we talked about Rachel Carson as the fable for tomorrow, a fable for tomorrow, intentionally dramatizing the idea of, oh, we have this idyllic place, and suddenly, so there's something of that here, right, to shock us into an awareness of maybe of what's happening. I'm thinking of also the community stories are also syncretistic. They're syncretic, whichever way you want to spell that. They are a mix of different traditions. It's kind of like the Bon Bibi myth, which I was fortunate enough to go to the Sundarbans, and you see the Bon Bibi in different areas, a lot of places, that Amitav Ghosh talks about in The Hungry Tide. And that's about, it's Arab Muslim, it's folk Hindu, it's interesting melange of, it's syncretistic, it's classic folk, right? By folk, I mean non-dominant, right? In the same way, as one critic notes, one reader notes, Joseph's novel reflects this by borrowing from Hindu, Muslim, and Christian narratives. So it's intent. Now, that can also, this hybrid, sort of Creole, if you will, narrative, also reflects the hybridity of the environment, right? And this hybridity is what's threatened by a kind of monolithic, narrow tunnel view of what development means, right? And I'll end with this. I think we just have, yes, just right. So this Arcadian setting, she presents at the beginning of the novel, is shattered by the arrival of outside polluters. So one character describes it this way, one of the village characters. I'm afraid to look into the water now, can't see through to the bottom at all. The very feel of it has changed. I've given up searching among the roots and hollows of the mangrove trees. Where have all the prawns gone? The roots are crushed by the concrete piles driven among them. Gag your mouth and nose for a few minutes and see for yourself. Wouldn't you die? The little mangrove trees have started dying from their roots up. The prawns and karimin have gone elsewhere looking for safe places to breed. Bridges should not be built where they breed. That will be the end of fishing. So her characterization of toxicity and pollution is also illustrated by these lines. But all of this belonged to the distant past that had vanished without a trace. So again, reflecting on now, recollecting what had been, that's the fictional conceit. Now the same grass lay coagulated in thick, pitchy sludge. Unable to sit or even stand on it, the people were sorely distressed. The water itself lay black and gluey, and on its surface lingered malodorous bubbles. Marcos felt nauseated at the thought of stepping into that water. Contrary to custom, the storyteller had had his bath in a lotus pond somewhere else before coming here. So it's too polluted even for stories. In a sense, stories are then becoming polluted, right? By extension. So just to sum up what we've been talking about today then, if I can, I'm not sure I can sum it up, but in the 19th century, colonially educated writers are searching for ways of expressing their national longing in terms of a modern state. This is evolving, so it's not static. And, we have the benefit of hindsight, right? We always do when we read backwards like that. When you're in the middle of it, you can't see it. Like today, it'd be interesting to read 20 years from now what was happening in 2025 that we did not see, right? So I think the takeaway is that they were searching for different ways of expressing, we might call them different idioms, in which to express both a modern state and an Indian ethos. So European romantic tropes coalesce with classical Indian tropes in this effort, right, to talk about a homeland. Today, as again, I'm sort of summarizing here, in Northeast Indian writers are doing the same, right? That has not ended. That is still continuing. So that's a reminder that it is not in the past, right? That these efforts still are happening, as they are with Native American writers, for example, as we'll see in another lecture. We're going to look at some more novels. And I think that these are the takeaway then when I said that this was part of, what did I call this? The survey of some recent voices. It's just a touch, right? And I too, I can't keep up with all the writing. It's wonderful writing coming out. So I think as one thing you could do then is, get even a deeper grasp of all these wonderful writings that are coming out that do succeed in alerting us to this slow violence that's occurring in the world today, which is so hard to see at times. So I'm not sure if we reached 1 hour, but I'll come to an end there for today. And I believe it is an hour. And we will resume tomorrow. So that's the end of lecture 6. Thank you very much.